January 11th to order. I'm going to go off script here for a couple of minutes. Was unable to do this yesterday because we had a number of people who attended Bob Steffen's funeral, but I know I noticed, and I know a number of you noticed, that the person who for years and years and years sat in the second row in the first seat was not in our committee yesterday. Bill Sneed had sat in that seat for a long, long time. Bill started his career at the insurance department, worked there for a number of years, and then he left the insurance department and went to Pulcinelli as their government relations person and specialized in insurance for a number of years. 5 years or so ago, Bill went out on his own and officed with Riley Scott and George Stafford and continued his own insurance lobbying business. Bill had other interests, which included banking and wine. I don't know whether any of you knew that Bill liked wine. Bill was maybe a bigger expert on wine than he was on insurance, and that's saying a lot because I know of no one who knew insurance better than Bill. Bill leaves behind his wife, Diane, son, Tanner, daughter, Sarah, 2 wonderful grandchildren that he was most proud of, and more friends than anybody deserves. Bill was truly a mentor to all of us, especially me, when it came to insurance matters, government affairs matters, politics. I could go on and on and on about Bill's sayings and Bill's mannerisms, but may Bill rest in peace, and he will sorely be missed in this committee and around the Capitol each and every day. Thank you. At this point, I'm going to request for bill introductions. Eric, I believe you have more.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm Eric Turk with the Kansas Insurance Department. We had 6 bill introductions yesterday. I'll go a little slower today for the audience. The first is RS 0128, which concerns group-funded workers' compensation pools. The department assesses these pools. We seek to repeal one of those assessments and return those funds to the pools. RS 0144, this concerns health maintenance organizations and their financial projections, which are required to transact business in the state of Kansas. We seek to remove excess and confusing requirements for those. RS 0182 concerns the definition of small employer in 2 different statutes. In Chapter 40, we seek to reconcile the differences there. Last is RS 0095, which concerns the insurance commissioner and the ability to lower fees associated with licensure of insurance agents and agencies.
Committee, are there any questions? Any objections? Eric, your bills will be introduced. Any other bill introductions? Well, hello, Mr. Murray. Come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dan Murray today here on behalf of the Kansas Association of Insurance Agents. Respectfully request introduction of a bill that would amend KSA 40-246C. That's RS 0137, and it reduces the surplus lines tax from 6% to 3%.
Committee, any questions? Any objections? Your bill will be introduced.
Sir.
Thank you, Dan. Any other bill introductions? I see none. We will now turn our attention to a presentation on capers. Alan, welcome. Glad you're here. I think this is my 3rd one this month.
Lucky you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I am glad to be here and spend a few minutes. The chair had asked a little bit of overview and maybe a little bit broader on a couple other subjects that may be coming your way this session, but certainly appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. And I think you all have the slides. Just briefly, of course, just to remind you, Capers is a big operation, over 300,000 members, over 1,500 employers, 3 retirement system, Capers, which serves state, local, and school members, police and fire retirement system, public safety, and then the retirement system for judges. So there's, a total of 1,500 employers, so all the school districts, all the counties, almost all the cities. City of Wichita is large enough to have their own retirement system, and then you get into all those other special purpose districts like townships and community colleges and conservation districts and on down the list. Capers is served by a board of, governed by a board of trustees that have that fiduciary responsibility. And you may remember there's 9 members, 4 appointed by the governor, 1 by the president of the Senate, 1 by the speaker of the House. Members get to elect 2, and then the state treasurer, by virtue of that office, is also on the board. So Treasurer Johnson now will be a trustee on the Capers system. On slide 4 then are just the areas that the chair had requested that I sort of try to briefly touch on. And of course always provide additional information at some other time as appropriate. But the funding status, a little bit on membership information, investment returns. I asked him if we could skip that one, and he said, no, we needed to talk about that one. So we will talk about that. The additional contributions, the $1.1 billion from last session, and then just a couple minor, one, our pension modernization system, our IT system, and then there is one piece of legislation that the board's requested. On slide 6, then, just it's an annual actuarial evaluation, so it's just a snapshot of where does the fund stand, where does Capers stand at the end of the calendar year. So, of course, this would have been December 31st of 2021. The actuary does her calculations, and the board receives the valuation report at their July board meeting. There was a slight decrease in the funded ratio, and funded ratio is assets to liability. And you may remember if it's below 60%, then that's certainly the red lights are flashing and somebody needs to do something. If you're between 60 and 80, still cautionary. You need to kind of watch things, and you really want to be over 80% on your way to 100%. So the valuation as of the end of last December, we were at 71.6% for the whole system, and the unfunded actuarial valuation, that liability rose to $9.8 billion with a B. And several things, of course, drove that, but probably one of the biggest one was in terms of making those actuarial valuation calculations, probably the single biggest piece in that calculation is what's the assumed rate of return. So if you have $25 billion and you assume you're going to earn whatever over the next 50 years, if you adjust that assumed rate, it's going to either up or down, it will have a big impact. And the board, after quite a bit of analysis and from our investment consultant, from our actuarial consultant, decided, and really the process is really ultimately almost over a whole year of board meetings, they decided to lower it from 7.75, where it had been for a number of years, down to 7%. And that change then increased that unfunded actuarial liability by $2.7 billion, also with a B. And you can see on slide 5, you can see the breakdown. Of course, state school being the largest group, $1.8 billion there. And of course, the state pays that, the employer contribution for all, not only for all state employees, but all local school employees as part of state aid to education. On the other side, of course, in this valuation was, I guess now a couple of sessions ago, the legislature authorized $500 million in pension obligation bonds, and those were sold. Capers got the proceeds, the state's paying the debt service, and so that was a positive in that calculation as well. And we'll talk about then the investment returns for that fiscal year in just a minute. On slide 6, though, I guess on the positive side then, all of the employer groups are paying that full actuarially required rate. And our actuary will tell us, and I've tried to convey that, probably the single biggest long-term factor is are the employers paying what they're supposed to, what's necessary to satisfy the actuarial obligation? And some of you may remember through the years and budget difficulties, in fact, it was 25 years, the legislature, policymakers decided at the time to contribute less, still always making contributions, but making less than what the actuary had suggested. And so that difference between the actuarially required rate and what was actually paid doesn't go away. It just flows to that unfunded actuarial liability. And at the time, then we were charging that 7.75% interest on the assumed rate. And out of all the factors that make up that $9.8 billion of unfunded actuarial liability, those years of paying less than what was required is still the largest single factor that makes up the unfunded actuarial liability. But on the plus side, policymakers since 2017 have stepped up, made KPERS funding a priority, and one way or another since the 2017 valuation, the legislature has contributed the actuarially required right. So that really helps the long-term funding of KPERS, and so that's very, very key. And so certainly, I know the Board of Trustees appreciates the support of policymakers like you all in terms of paying that actuarially required right amount is very, very important. And I'll just make one other note on that decision to go to 7%. Again, at 7.75, we were the highest. That was the highest assumed rate of any public pension plan in the country. State plan, and now we're at 7%, and so we're right in the middle of that, and so of what other plans, and not that necessarily makes it right, but it's at least an indicator that we're in the ballpark. And you want to have that assumed rate correct, because if it's either too high or too low, that means current employers maybe are paying too much or not enough. And then depending on which way it's going, future employers then will have to pick that shift up, either or might realize a gain, but if the current ones aren't paying enough, future employers will have to pay more. And so it's that intergenerational equity that the rate's trying to achieve. Next topic, slide 7, is just the active membership. 152,000 KPERS members, and so those are people actively working. In total, there's over 300,000 KPERS members. So it's really 11% of the Kansas population has a direct connection to KPERS, either actively working, either retired, or have credit as KPERS service, but haven't retired yet. And those active members range in age from 16 up to 90. And so we have some healthy, vigorous people. Again, I think I may have said we're not sure exactly what that person may be doing at 90, but I'm guessing it's probably in a school district somewhere where they're helping out filling a need. So certainly there. Our active membership, it really has stayed pretty consistent. It did go down about 1% in calendar year 2021, mostly in the state and local groups. It's been kind of in that neighborhood, kind of virtually flat for more than a decade. And of course, the largest group, 70%, is in the state school group, and you can see that pie chart between state, local, and so forth. Again, that point where the state pays the employer contribution, not only for all state employees, but all school employees, state aid education, it fluctuates, but it's, probably over about $700 million annually mainly from the general fund that comes to KPERS. So it's certainly a factor in the state budget, and certainly appreciate that. And most of those active KPERS members in all the systems have between about 10 and 11 years of service. Slide 8 just looks at that active member distribution, and these are kind of busy slides. It breaks it down between that KPERS 1, KPERS 2, and KPERS 3, the 3 KPERS plan groups. KPERS 1 members have membership before 2009. KPERS 2 memberships between 2009 and the end of 2014, and then KPERS 3 membership since 2015, and then judges and KPNF, but mainly you can see of course, by the numbers. The average age for the active people for KPERS is around 45, KPNF about 38, and judges about 57. And on average then, it's about 10 years of service that the current active members have in all the systems. And you can see there that 0 to 5 then, which means that now the KPERS 3 group, the newest group, the cash balance group, is the largest single group within KPERS. So it's larger than KPERS 1, of course, as those people start to retire. KPERS 2, of course, had a limited membership window, but just with the turnover in public employees, KPERS 3 is now our largest group of active members. On slide 9 then is just that look at membership, over 111,000 retirees. I think I've shared with some of you, retirees age range from 50 up to 111, beneficiaries from 15 up to 110. And we did some looking the other day, and the person that's received a KPERS retirement benefit the longest, so when they retired, they're still receiving it. We paid them 45 years on their retirement benefit. And of course, as the plan matures, and of course, there's more retirees coming, but and retiring out of KPERS, but about 88% of the retirees remain in Kansas. And just as a quick quiz, I looked to see kind of where the distribution is. Any guess on where you think they might be if they're not in Kansas? They're in Missouri. And then Oklahoma, Texas, and then you get to Florida and Arizona. It'd be the other sort of top five or six. But yeah, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, and Arizona. And we do have about 32 retirees that live in foreign countries. So. 10 and 11 are just graphics, and you can just by county, and this is the number of retirees. Doesn't include beneficiaries, and so you can just see by county how the KPERS retirees, how those roughly 88% are distributed across the state. Slide 11 just takes that map again, and then what's that average monthly benefit by county across the state? And again, you know, it fluctuates because you remember KPERS benefits based on final average salary, years of service, and then that multiplier, which is, you know, depending on the system, started out at 1 and 1.4 and 1.7 and 1.75, 1.85, and so forth. So anyway, just a lot of factors that go into that, but just the average, you know, benefit, so you can see how that would sort of pay out over a year. And of course, KPERS is designed to be operate in conjunction with Social Security, so that retirees would also see KPERS, or KPERS benefit, but also Social Security. On slide 12 is the subject that I'm going to race through, but talks about investment experience. And of course, the trust fund, about half of the income to the trust fund comes from investments. Employer contributions are about a little over a third, and then member contributions make up the difference. And of course, by the way a defined benefit plan works, no matter what happens on the investment side, the plug factor is the employer contributions. Those are adjusted up or down depending on what's going on in the investment world to fully fund the system to get it done by the end of the amortization period. So again, what a difference a year it makes, and clearly those of you that may follow your own investments, at the end of calendar year 2021, we were at positive 16.1%, and through the end of November for calendar year 2022, we're just finalizing the December numbers, and we'll have those here in a bit, but the calendar year 2022 numbers at the end of November is a negative 7.4%. On a fiscal year basis, then through last June, it's a negative 4.77%. And again, that change in assumption. And you can see, again, these numbers are so time sensitive, but at the end of November, so if you look back 12 months from the end of November, it's a negative 5.4%. Looking back 3 years, 6.9, 6.8, 5 years, 10 years, 8.2, and then the 25-year period at positive 7.72. On slide 13 then, maybe might be the most helpful, or maybe if you walk away with one thought for further reference, this just shows that historical fiscal year returns. And clearly, you can see that dotted line is that assumed rate of return, and so are we above or below it? So looking back the last 25 years, we've had 5 years of negative, 2001, 2002, 2008, 2009, and now here in 2022. There were 6 years that it was positive, but less than that assumed rate of return, and then we've had 14 years of positive returns. And so clearly lots going on in the market, and you're probably all familiar with it in terms of that volatility, whether it's inflation or globally, are we headed towards a recession or not, what the central bank's doing, not only in the U.S., but again, internationally. Of course, what's going on in Ukraine, with Russia, China and their COVID issues. Of course, all that certainly has an impact on what's going on in the market, which reflects in returns. But again, it comes to the employers to continue to pay the required contributions. On slide 14 then is just talk about the additional funding. And again, the legislature last year, you may remember, appropriated an additional $1.1 billion with a B to KPERS. And I think to the wisdom of the credit to the legislature, because of all the volatility, that money came to us in 4 different payments over the course of the calendar year, and you can see those amounts there at the top of slide 14. But that helped reduce the risk of market timing rather than us just getting all the $1.1 billion all at one time. Those first payments we received, there were some layering payments that were missed in fiscal year 2017 and 2019 that the legislature decided to pay over a 20-year period. And so that first amount paid that obligation off, so that debt was extinguished and we got the money. Then the balance went, just that $871 million went to improve the funded status of the system. Of course, we got the money, it was invested, and that will be reflected in the next actuarial evaluation, because the $1.1 billion actuarial evaluations again on our calendar year basis, and so the valuation I was just talking about did not capture this. This will be in the next valuation. On slide 15, just real quickly, just to remind you, and I think we talked briefly last year, but our current pension administration, our IT system, really started in 2005. And of course, there have been lots of changes since you think back over that time. The KPERS 1, KPERS 2, KPERS 3, working after retirement, drop program, on down the list. And so our system, of course, has to be modified to adjust to those changes, which it's done. But all those additional sort of modifications over time based on this 2005 platform, and there have been updates to that over time. There have been some challenges, but clearly we're still receiving contributions. We're still paying those monthly benefits. I think initially we had thought our current vendor would be able to maybe upgrade in place because of their knowledge of the system. But as we've worked with them over the summer, they've not met our current expectations, and their revised cost estimates continue to go up. And so we've decided at this point it really makes sense to go out for a request for proposal and test the market and see what we get. On slide 16 then, we're starting that process, and of course we'll go to CEDO, we'll go to the Joint Committee, provide all that information. In the meantime here, as we've worked with our vendor, we've gotten all the requirements that'll be needed. We've did a needs assessment. We've been doing lots of things to sort of stabilize the current system, so which I think will position us, because assuming if we would go to a new vendor, we're probably talking 4 or 5 years out, and so we got to make sure our current system continues to operate efficiently as we can make it. So I think the work that's been done stabilizing the current system has been appropriately spent, but we'll start that process. On slide 17, of course, the legislature has been supportive of the modernization effort. We've got some appropriations for that assessment and to start the stabilization project. And once we get the RFP, certainly we'll share that information with the JCIT and other policymakers as well. And then on slide 18 is the last slide. And generally, the Board of Trustees do not request legislation, since the legislature really is the plan sponsors of the trust fund. You're the ultimate one that decide on benefits, you decide on funding and so forth. They did ask for introduction of a bill, which was taken to the Joint Pensions Committee, which I believe endorsed that for introduction. And so that'll be winding its way through the process, hopefully. But just briefly, there's currently a statutory 15% cap on alternative investments, mainly private equity types of investments, and that's been in place for 10 years. And with that volatility in the market, and as the trust fund fluctuates, then this 15% cap, we're not there yet, but we're getting closer. And as you get closer, then you got to decide, are you going to continue on with your sort of current investment plan, or do you think you're going to bump up against that cap? And clearly with private equity, there's lots of lead time on that. So the board decided to come to the legislature and ask you not to there'd still be a cap, but it'd be decided by the Board of Trustees rather than placed in statute. And so you'll eventually may get a chance to see that bill, but just wanted to give you a heads up. So it relates to alternative investments, changing who controls the cap from the statute to the board. So as they do their asset allocation, as they modify or review investments and try to maximize return with the lowest risk, that's certainly a factor that they're going to have to start considering. And so that bill, again, has been authorized by the Joint Committee and will be coming its way. So anyway, hopefully I've touched on the topics you requested, Mr. Chair, and certainly be glad to respond to any questions now or later.
Alan, thank you. A couple of other points, and then we'll open it up for questions. The alternative investment cap bill is in proofing right now, so it's almost ready to go, and we'll get that introduced and schedule hearing on it. Another recommendation that came out of the Joint Committee was a request to establish a select committee to study the Tier 3. Tier 3 is now our largest members of KPERS, and that legislation was passed and approved in 12, I believe, and implemented in 2015. And so I don't think anybody's taken a look at it since then, so that select committee would be charged with reviewing Tier 3, see if it's meeting the objectives that we intended it to when we adopted it in 2012. And so hopefully that request will be granted by the Senate President, and we can establish that select committee. I'm envisioning probably 4 or 5 meetings during session, and then any legislation or changes that would come out of that could either be handled this session or next. The next topic, Alan, I don't want to throw you under the bus, but I know all of us are receiving a lot of emails about COLA. And you and I have had this discussion, but if we could have the discussion a little bit in the committee so that we are better able to respond to our constituents. So first point I'd like to make is that there is no actuarial planning for a COLA in the plan. And so any kind of COLA that would be granted either needs to come out of legislative SGF, or we are going to further increase our unfunded actuarial liability. With your presentation today and my hopefully good math, we have 111,000 retirees on the system right now. So even if $100 a month was a meaningful COLA, that equates to about $133,200,000 to pay for a $100 a month COLA. And so as we visit with our constituents, I think it's important to point out that that's what the cost is on that dollar figure. And then also that is a recurring cost each and every year. And so certainly understand that inflation is eating away at the buying power of our retirees, but also when you put it into the other perspective of what it costs. So, Alan, is my math right?
Yes, always, Mr. Chair. And particularly when you get into that actuarial calculation of down the road, then it goes up because, again, it wouldn't be pre-funded. So that means it hasn't, those contributions to pay that haven't been in the trust fund to earn the money. So the actuarial costs, as you go out, those numbers go up pretty sizably.
Hope that helps in your communications with your constituents. I have no doubt we'll see a bill sometime this year on a COLA, and so we'll take it and evaluate the cost of it. I don't know whether it will come to here or whether it will go to Ways and Means, but we had one last year, we had one the year before, and I know it's still a concern of many of our constituents. The third topic I want to briefly touch on, during the Joint Committee, we had a great presentation from your CIO on investment policies and how investment managers are evaluated and how they are hired. I know that we have a lot of concern about ESG and how it's being applied in not only private business but pension funds. So could you briefly describe, give us a very high altitude conversation about how your investment managers are chosen and what they're charged to do, and then also your internal policies that may provide some safeguards.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of choosing of those, it's on a competitive basis. So, and certainly the services they provide and the cost that they would charge to manage those funds certainly is a factor. So, and we've had a long relationship, of course, with several of them, but it's competitive basis based on service, what they can offer, and fees. And of course, all the investment managers, I mean, there's really two things. The board policy, of course, is to maximize return based on the lowest risk. And then there's the statutory language that says KPERS investments always have to be done for the benefit of the member. You can't factor in social or economic. So again, kind of from those dark days, the KPERS investments going way back, you know, there was at the time some KPERS funds that were directed to economic development within Kansas. And there were some difficulties with that. And ultimately this language, you know, that no monies in the fund shall be invested or reinvested if the sole or primary investment objective is for economic development or social purposes or objects. So the board's investing what's the best for the member, best return, lowest risk. And that's, and then so that's reflected in the investment policy. All the fund managers have to sign it, have to follow it, and have to do their investments based on that statute and then the policy. And so, and then the board periodically gets reports in terms of how you know, those investment managers are doing, and in terms of and it usually comes out in the proxy voting side. So, you know, a lot of our big investments are passively managed, which means they just replicate. It's called the Russell 3000. And so whatever's in the Russell 3000, that's what our manager has to get to. And so that's what they do. And then, but also, as a large institutional investor, in fact, this next board meeting, we're going to receive a report, our annual report on proxy voting, but our managers vote over 90,000 proxy votes on our behalf every year. And some of them, of course, are, you know, hire the external financial auditor. Well, that's got to go, they've got to vote on that. Some of them, you know, compensation for their board or policy, things like that. And so anyway, but our chief investment officer can provide lots more information. We get a high-level assessment of how the proxy voting is done by each of our managers, and certainly be glad to provide that or have him come and visit with you whenever you'd like.
Alan, thank you. I know there's most likely going to be a bill. I don't know whether it will come to us or it will go to another committee, but I appreciate the background on that. I think the joint committee was also, we were relieved and reassured by your CIO that things are being done properly over there, and that the concerns about ESG across the country may not be in Kansas. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple questions. Alan, we're at 7%. There's no appetite to go lower, is there? And where did we start at?
At 7.75, we'd been at 8%. We'd been at 8% for a long, long time, and then a couple years ago it was ratcheted down to 7.75, and now we're at 7. And I think every couple years the board does it's called an asset allocation study, and so they're looking at all those factors. But I think given that they just spent a year talking about that assumed rate of return, I don't believe there's. I think they feel comfortable that they made the right decision and that 7% is still appropriate.
Okay, got one more. When we did phase 3 or tier 3, the cash balance plan, we kind of duplicated that at another board I was on. And one thing we noticed right away, the unfunded was a very, very small amount. Have you broken them down on the unfunded and the different brackets? And, you know, we're now in it 5, 7, 8 years. Is that unfunded very small? So are we gonna, I know we re-amortized when we redid phase 3. Are we just basically gonna work our way out of this unfunded?
Couple points there. Again, the key factors is as we march forward, will the legislature continue to pay that actuarially required rate? So if that happens, that's probably the biggest factor. But you're right, KPERS 3 by plan design, and that was one of the decisions at the time, was to lower the cost on employers because it's a different benefit structure. And so the actual cost for, and of course the employer contribution, so much of it is to pay that unfunded liability, so for prior years. But if you just look at what's the cost for a KPERS 3 member, for somebody, you know, set aside that unfunded liability, but what's the obligation on the employer side for KPERS 3, you're probably in a 1 or 2% range. And the member is contributing 6.
That'd be a nice sheet to have, maybe,
yeah.
or breakdown. Thank you.
Yep, it's called normal cost, but yep, we can do that.
Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Conrad. I've got three. I'm just going to layer on top of what Senator Olson was talking about. It seems as though the number that we use as a rate of return obviously has a big impact on what that unfunded liability is, and making choices to change that can really influence how we approach it here at the legislature. And to see it go from 8 to 7% in this kind of year, I mean, it's kind of a drastic move, given that it only ratcheted down 0.25% before. So I'm concerned, because if we're going to use those and we're going to see a 70%, it goes out to the public, it goes into our to us and we say, hey, now we're at 70%. We thought we were at 80% last year when we did all this stuff, right? And so we're changing a lot.
Right. And we hadn't gotten to 80%.
I know.
We were getting very close, depending on the returns and depending on, had that assumption not changed, had the market stayed positive, 7%, we probably would be knocking on that door of 80%. But change in assumptions, change in the market, that, of course, we're still in the 70%, which is good. And I think the hope is, of course, in this next valuation with the $1.1 billion, and not to get too down in the weeds, but actuarial reserve funding, it's called smoothing, where you take the returns for a given year and then you spread it out over 5 years. And then, so it doesn't impact the employer contributions way up or way down in a single year. And so in that actuarial reserve bucket, we have a positive $2 billion yet to be realized when the actuary does the valuation. So we get a 20% of it. And so right now we have 4 good years of positive and we have 1 negative year. So once this valuation is plugged in, the oldest, which is a negative year, will drop off, but it'll be replaced by a negative. So we'll still have 4 years of positive in that actuarial reserve bucket and 1 year of negative. So that'll help mitigate it to some extent.
Second one is I'm really excited about the KPERS 3 Select Committee. If we do that, I think that we do have to look at that and understand and compare really what we've done with our benefits to our beneficiaries out there. Understanding, of course, the benefits to the employers and reducing the obligation, but we have to look at the beneficiaries, and hopefully that comes as part of that. And the last thing is just on the constraints. He mentioned the ESG constraints. Can you just explain, I mean, we as a state, we don't want to invest necessarily in companies that have slave labor as an example, right? And do we have statutes in place that already do some of those constraints now?
No, not in terms of KPERS investment. I mean, as long as it's, doesn't violate state law, federal law, those kinds of things. But assuming that, then, that guiding factor is, what's the best thing for the fund, minimizing risk, maximizing return, but not based, on those economic development or social purposes are really the only statutory constraints.
Is it fair to say that if we do start putting constraints in place and they get to be more significant than maybe 1 or 2 things like don't invest in North Korea or whatever, that we are limiting the ability of our fund managers to meet that objective?
Yes, and there's lots of different calculations, but so right now, as you limit the ability of the fund managers to make investments, at least, I think in the investment world, they say that reduces the risk of being able to maximize investments and hence return. So the smaller the pool, then those factors, so less investment opportunities and maybe lower risk. And so again, policymakers, if we don't make it on the investment side, it's going to fall to the employer side. So it would be ultimately, it could be reflected in higher employer contribution rates.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alan, thank you for your presentation. There was a single sheet put out, it was either last year or the year before, that talked about if we put $1 billion in, what that would do. You remember that sheet?
I do, yes.
I couldn't find it this morning, so it was buried. But it was something about we was going to save $75 million a year. Is that still on track with us putting that $1 billion in last year? Or might talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that assumes, so if we had that money, we had the $1.1 billion, then we could invest it. And I assume that, if I remember correctly, the projections probably would have, at that time, assumed that 7.75% going forward. So I think a similar calculation would probably be something less, because now we would assume, since the boards changed that assumed rate of return, it would be something less than that. But again, trust funds now $1.1 billion stronger because of that, and so we're able to invest that for projection purposes. Unless directed otherwise, we would assume over the long term we're going to earn 7%.
follow-up question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I look at the, on page 5, the funded status, you know, it says 12/31/2021. When does 22 come out? When do we get a real feel what's going to happen with last year with the $1 billion and that kind of thing?
Right. Well, in terms of the actuarial valuation, it's on a calendar year basis. So, so the calendar year just closed, and as I said, we're still finalizing the December investment numbers. But the valuation is, by the actuary, it's presented in July to the board, and the board accepts it in July. It takes quite a number of months for those actuarial calculations to play out. Now, if, you know, we could always do some back of the envelope thing that makes actuaries very nervous when you do that. But we could, you know, we could work with you on that and at least try to get in the ballpark once we get those final, particularly the final investment numbers from December.
Okay. One more. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What's your thoughts if we was to drop another $1 billion in that this year?
I think, well, on the one hand, clearly it would be strengthen the trust fund. It would be paying down debt of the, you know, the obligation, the unfunded actuarial liability. Most of it belongs to the state. It's, you know, pay me now, pay me later kind of thing. So paying down that debt, it strengthens the fund. It's going to increase the funded ratio. And so, our investment people, you know, maybe this is, if you're going to be buying, maybe this is a good time to be buying before the economy takes off and those prices, as you look after 2001, 2002, 2008, 2009, the economy took off. Once it turns that corner, whenever that's going to be, whether it's in 23 or what point. And so in terms of purchasing things, now might be a time to go into the market rather than run from the market.
Safe to assume you wouldn't turn it down?
That's correct. We would welcome it, Mr. Chair.
Any additional questions? I see none now, and thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure that we'll get to see more of you as the session progresses, but we always appreciate your very informative presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Maybe that's all we have on the agenda for today. We will meet tomorrow. I believe we have a presentation from the Credit Union Supervisor and Heartland Credit Union Association. So see what the status of our credit unions across the state are. So with that, we're adjourned.